This morning, the president tweeted, quote, "I will be leaving for Florida today to meet with some of the bravest people on earth, but people whose lives have been totally shattered. I'm also working with Congress on many fronts." While McClatchy White House correspondent Anita Kumar is in Washington, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Read your article, Anita. So the president said that he would tackle school safety. He also brought up mental health issues. He did not talk about guns and gun legislation in his address. We know, even though he decided to focus on mental health, that it was his administration that really wasted no time in reversing an Obama-era rule that would limit people who were severely mentally ill or mentally disabled from accessing guns. What does the White House have to say about that? How do they square that?
Oh, well, you know, they don't talk much about guns at all. And you'll see this is the third, I think this is the third major mass shooting since he's been president, and he hasn't mentioned it any time. The last time was in Texas in, I think, the fall, when that was that awful church shooting. He also talked about mental health. So they've been really stressing mental health over guns, you know, for the entire time that he's been in office. You did mention that Obama-era regulation that had been passed, and what they've said overall about regulations is that there's just too many, Obama over-regulated things, and they're trying to get rid of that. So actually what happened in that is that Congress was allowed to rescind that, and then he signed that into law. So it gets rid of that. It changed about 75,000 names off the registry list. So you have to go through a background check, and it would have added 75,000 names to that. And so they did get rid of that.
Right, and there's no indication that that law would have had any impact on whether or not this gunman would be able to buy the gun, but it's certainly sort of, one could suggest that it indicates something somewhat disingenuous when you say, you know, what we have to do is put more resources into mental health, but then there you are reversing a rule that would have challenged people who were severely mentally ill from getting guns like this.
Right. I mean, there is no indication that this would have affected this particular crime. But you're right. I mean, it seems to send conflicting signals. When Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, was asked about not this rule, but just about mental health late last year, remember this is after he'd already talked about mental health once before at another mass shooting, she said, well, you know, we're looking into that, but we don't have anything specific, and it didn't sound like she expected anything to be coming out of the White House. It was more, you know, sort of in discussions with lawmakers. We haven't really seen any sign of that, though.
Yeah, this is the third mass shooting that the president has had to address the nation about. Do you see anything different about his statement yesterday? You know, how does the administration, how well are they handling these sort of things?
I felt like it was somewhat different because it was a school shooting. Him directly speaking to school children was very striking, not something I remember him obviously doing. This was the first mass shooting at a school he's had. So, you know, if you'll remember after Las Vegas, after that shooting, he talked about evil, you know, this shooter, you know, the gunman and evil. So his words were a little bit more, you know, aggressive, I would say. But, you know, overall, his statements have all struck the right chord, but they seem sort of generic. They could be after any national tragedy. He spoke similarly after the hurricanes hit last year, and there was so much devastation. You know, if you know, I compare it to Barack Obama, who I also covered. His were very personal statements. He always talked about the victims, you know, names. It was very personal. I mean, I remember sometimes that he, you know, had tears in his eyes. It just wasn't. It's a very different feel with President Trump.
Yeah, you point out in your article that President Trump is the first president in 30 years to address the NRA's national meeting that they have, and he thanked the NRA for the support that he received that helped him to get to the White House. You know, we just heard from Senator Bill Nelson. You quote Senator Marco Rubio in your piece. Both senators, a Democrat and a Republican, mentioned the need for some sort of leadership from the top, for the president to lead the way in terms of getting gun legislation introduced, passed, whatever. Why can't Congress just pursue this on its own?
I'll go back to President Obama, who pursued this aggressively after the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. He spoke about it across the country. His Vice President Joe Biden spoke about it. He had lawmakers over to the White House. He pushed it harder, you know, probably than anything else in his second term, really, and he didn't get anywhere. If you'll remember, the Senate voted down the background check bill that he wanted. So it does take leadership, but it's going to take something else too, because we clearly saw that in the last administration it did not work. Congress could take it up, but it was very striking yesterday. It's a similar pattern that happens after every shooting. Democrats, for the most part, will say it's time to talk about gun rights and gun control, rather, and you'll see the Republicans saying, let's talk about other issues, mental health. It's too soon to be talking about guns. You know, and they have one thing that they always go back to, which is certain one of these bills that they're talking about won't necessarily prevent this particular shooting. So you talked about the regulation that President Trump rescinded. That wouldn't have prevented this. So they always kind of go back to that and say, well, you can do all these things, but it's not really going to prevent this particular shooting. So we saw a very familiar pattern yesterday. It does not look like they're going to take this up.
Yeah, certainly. So we heard from the president that he will be heading to Florida. He was going to be heading to Florida anyways, but he will be heading to this area where the shooting occurred. He will be meeting presumably with victims, families, other people in authority there. We've heard some very passionate words from the students who were in that school, parents, that mother. I know, Anita, you heard that mother whose daughter was killed. I mean, it was heart-wrenching listening to her scream into the microphone, demanding that the president do something. What sort of reception do you imagine the president will receive?
I think it's going to be very, very similar. This shooting was striking in that these children, you know, this wasn't, you know, 6-year-olds like in Connecticut. These were high school students who use social media, who are vocal, who are out there talking about how they want a change, that the president and Congress needs to do something. So I think he'll hear from a lot more of those people when he does go there. You know, you did mention the president's tweet today. Yesterday at the White House, they were unclear about when he would actually be going. He is headed to Florida for the weekend, for the long President's Day weekend, to Palm Beach, where he has a resort, but it wasn't clear what day he's actually going to head over there. Yeah,
and as I understand it, at least talking earlier to Major Garrett, they're sort of keeping very quiet about the details of this.
Right. You know, after the Las Vegas shooting, he had said immediately that he would go, and he did go very quickly. I believe it was the next day, and he got some criticism saying that, you know, the investigators there were still very busy. It was still a crime scene. It was just too early for the president to go. So I think they're a little bit mindful of that. They did cancel a couple of other appearances unrelated in Florida, one next week that his campaign was doing. So they're sort of mindful of that. He is going for the weekend. He's going to be extremely close, though. He's going to be less than 1 hour away from where the shooting took place. So I think they're also looking at that and thinking they're so close that it makes sense. People will be wanting to see him over there.
Yeah, indeed. Anita, Kumar, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.